Welcome back to HackerNews.fm, your unofficial rapid-fire summary of what the HN crowd is buzzing about on December 4th, 2025. Today we've got AI running $100,000 stock portfolios and a looming RAM crunch that could stall everything from your laptop to the latest LLMs.
Plus, some sharp takes on leadership and a tiny Postgres you can ship anywhere. But first,
we're diving into how power really works when AI makes persuasion dirt cheap. Elites could shape mass preferences as AI reduces persuasion costs. All right, next up is polarization by design, how elites could shape mass preferences as AI reduces persuasion costs, which actually hit number 1 on Hacker News, about 545 points and over 500 comments.
yeah, and the paper's core idea is pretty wild. Once AI makes persuasion cheap and precise, elites can start treating public opinion as something they engineer, not just this messy thing they react to after the fact.
The model they use is basically, if you've got a single ruling group, the optimal play tends to be what they call a polarization poll. You push opinion into more extreme, highly polarized shapes, so you end up with a majority that's easier and cheaper to steer over time.
But if you've got two rival elites alternating in power, it can flip. Then they sometimes prefer these semi-lock zones, opinions that are cohesive, sticky, and hard for the other side to move. So AI can either amp up polarization or actually damp it, depending on the game the elites are playing.
Hacker News, of course, immediately drags in classic poli-sci. One commenter cites Philip Converse and basically asks whether the public even has real opinions. They use tariffs as the example of people going on belly feel instead of anything like a stable ideology.
And others are like, look, the problem isn't the masses getting a say, it's that people have stopped electing smart people. Plus, we've normalized never challenging each other. The whole don't talk politics at Thanksgiving norm that just keeps everything shallow.
Then you get the straight-to-AI angle. Someone calls this Cambridge Analytica as a chatbot, and another person points out that LLMs are already cranking out dishonest, adversarial propaganda and disinfo at scale. Like, we don't need any fancy new theory to see that happening.
There's pushback, though. One commenter argues that LLMs actually decentralize persuasion. AI reduces persuasion cost, so it's not only elites who can do this. But another points out that, in practice, ownership of the most powerful models is already highly centralized. Only big actors like Musk or Altman can really tune them. So you still need control of the major platforms and distribution for it to matter. The bottleneck just shifts to who owns the infrastructure and the attention channels.
I loved the really dark joke that banning AI would actually concentrate persuasive power back into elite hands, and that an essay warning you about elites using AI to shape your opinions could itself be part of that exact persuasion campaign.
People are also worried about the subtler stuff, like AI making doing bad things way cheaper or spawning multitudes of propaganda bots aimed at any user. And that plugs straight back into the paper's majority rule model. If you can flood the system with fake or nudged preferences, you're not just reading public opinion, you're rewriting it.
So if polarization is becoming a deliberate strategy instead of just an accident, maybe the takeaway for listeners is, whenever a piece of political content feels creepily custom fit to you, pause. Ask who's optimizing that persuasion pipeline and what game they're actually playing. Our next story. We gave 5 LLMs $100K to trade stocks for 8 months. That headline alone got it to number 1 on Hacker News. 233 points, 184 comments.
Yeah, they ran 5 models: GPT-5, Claude, Gemini, Grok, and DeepSeek, each with $100K in paper money over about 8 months, benchmarked against the S&P 500. Grok ends up about 56% up, roughly $156K on that starting stake. Gemini actually loses around 10%, down near 90K. The S&P's up only about 12% to around 112, and DeepSeek comes in second, a bit behind Grok.
And crucial detail, This is backtesting, not live trading. They replay historical data and pretend to trade. Classic paper trading. One quant in the thread literally says they stopped reading after paper money.
Other quants push back like, look, with 100K in big US stocks, market impact is basically zero. But they still complain that simulations miss front-running, slippage, all the messy real-world stuff. One commenter says they were doubling and tripling a paper account. Then when they tried the same thing for real money, it didn't do very well at all.
The top comment has great spidey sense. All the winning models just piled into tech, so maybe we're mostly measuring own a bunch of semiconductors in a bull market. Someone jokes, they just confirmed that tech stocks in the US did pretty well.
And folks want stronger methodology. Multiple time intervals, Monte Carlo style. Right now it's one run, over one 8-month bull stretch. The OP even admits, by no means is this statistically significant, and notes that a single Claude run costs like $200 to $300 in API fees.
There's also a nice finance nerd nitpick. A PhD suggests reporting abnormal returns, actual alpha over standard factors, not just raw percentages.
So maybe the takeaway isn't LLMs have cracked Wall Street. It's more, here's a slick way to visualize what different models would have done. Fun playground. But probably don't hand your retirement account to Grok just yet.
All right, next up is the RAM shortage comes for us all, which hit #1 on Hacker News today. About 345 points and 365 comments. And it kind of tied together two other front page stories. That PC World piece about Samsung not selling RAM to Samsung, and this PC part picker graph of DRAM prices that was sitting at #4.
Yeah, Gearline opens with a bit of a gut punch. The 64-gig DDR5 kit he bought for $209 earlier this year is now $650. 650. He literally says, memory price inflation comes for us all, and then points the finger squarely at AI data center buildouts just hoovering up the supply.
And he walks through the collateral damage, right? Raspberry Pi hiking prices, Micron killing off the crucial consumer brand, little SBC vendors like Libre Computer seeing a single 4GB LP DDR4 chip cost more than the rest of the board combined. That's where this really hurts. The hobbyists and the tiny hardware shops that can't just eat a 3x bill of materials.
Maybe worth unpacking the tech a bit. RAM here is DRAM, the main working memory in your PC or phone. DDR4 and DDR5 are just different generations of that. HBM is this ultra-fast stacked RAM that's glued right next to GPUs for AI workloads. The fabs are shifting capacity from cheap desktop DRAM to high-margin HBM and server DDR5 because, of course they are.
And that PC part picker thread really made it visual. One commenter calculated DDR4 kits are up about 2.8x in 18 months, DDR5 closer to 3.6x. Another pointed out OpenAI's contracts for something like 900,000 wafers a month, roughly 40% of global DRAM capacity, so everyone else is basically fighting over scraps.
Then that Samsung story shows how weird it's gotten. Samsung's semiconductor arm reportedly rejected a long-term DRAM deal from Samsung's own phone division. So the phone guys get forced into these short, quarterly renegotiations. Hence the headline, RAM is so expensive, Samsung won't even sell it to Samsung.
Hacker News had a very HN response to all this. Some people were like, fine, I'll just stick with DDR3, DDR4, and an old Dell tower running Linux. One commenter even listed current prices. DDR5 32GB at around $330, DDR4 at about $130, DDR3 32GB down at $50, and said used corporate e-waste works great.
But then the operators chimed in that DDR4 production is already winding down. Quotes for bulk RAM are, good for hours, not days. And one recycler said, used DDR4 gets bought large scale, reballed and resold as refurb chips. So that escape hatch of just use old stuff has its own crunch coming.
Meanwhile, server folks are like, We need a terabyte of DDR5, we'll just pay the premium and move on. A few commenters noted that even at 4 times prices, hardware is still small compared to software licenses and downtime, so enterprises just outbid everyone else without even blinking.
Geerling also pokes at this supposed silver lining that an AI crash will flood us with cheap hardware. His point is, this stuff is locked up in HBM modules and exotic GPU servers that don't plug into your gaming rig or home lab the way an old Dell R720 used to. So the AI bust yard sale fantasy might be oversold.
Taken together, the blog post, the Samsung drama, the PC part picker graphs, the mood on HN felt like toilet paper 2020, but for RAM. Plus, a lot of people suddenly very, very proud of the 128 gigabytes they bought 2 years ago.
So for now, maybe don't start that 256 gigabyte dream build unless you actually have to. Keep your old machines alive, squeeze a few more years out of them, and if you stumble on a reasonably priced RAM kit, it might be worth treating it like a rare collectible.
All right, next up is this essay, Transparent Leadership Beats Servant Leadership. It climbed to number 1 on Hacker News with around 400 plus points and almost 200 comments. So, yeah, people had opinions. It's on entropicthoughts.com. We'll throw the link in the notes.
Yeah, it's by KQR, and he basically says servant leadership ends up feeling like curling parenting. You know, the manager out front with a broom, sweeping every obstacle out of the way so the team never has to actually deal with anything themselves.
And instead, he pitches this alternative buzzword, transparent leadership. So, you coach people, connect them to each other, teach real problem solving, explain the underlying values, create direct links to stakeholders. And you keep training your replacement until, in theory, you're kind of redundant.
My favorite spicy line in there was, the middle manager that doesn't perform any useful work is a fun stereotype, but I also think it's a good target to aim for. And then, once your team's humming, you slide back into hands-on technical work as this high-powered spare worker you can drop onto the worst fires.
Hacker News, though, was not entirely sold. A lot of folks pushed back on his read of servant leadership. They argued he's kind of straw-manning it, and that what he calls transparent is just, servant leadership done properly.
Yeah, several commenters pointed out that in the classic sense, servant leadership is supposed to be about growing your team's capacity, not just this blocker removal butler who silently cleans up after everyone. And that in practice, the term's been warped and misused a lot, especially in big companies.
And then you get all the war stories. Somebody talked about being sent to the coaching habit training and realizing it matched how some of their managers behaved, basically turning into a kind of rubber duck, just sitting there asking questions over and over instead of ever, using actual authority to decide anything.
Yeah, and another person described a non-performing colleague where the boss just kept feeding them these lines about empowerment and growth instead of addressing it. So they themselves ended up feeling empowered to go find a new job somewhere else.
I really liked the comment that broke management down into mentoring, coaching, and sponsoring, and then added, what ICs often really need is, please just solve this problem for me. Which, to be fair, a lot of managers either can't do or aren't allowed to do.
Agile coaches took some strays too. Someone said there's nothing more infuriating than asking for help and getting that faux coaching response of, well, how would you solve the problem? When you've already spent hours trying to solve the problem.
Underneath all the snark, there was this strong outcome over process theme. One commenter basically said, look, we should judge management by whether problems actually go away, not by whether they followed the latest leadership playbook to the letter.
So the real takeaway for me isn't servant versus transparent as competing buzzwords. It's be honest, share context generously, and actually use your power to help people instead of hiding behind empowerment slogans and leadership jargon.
All right, next up is PG Lite embeddable Postgres, which actually hit #1 on Hacker News with around 541 points and 105 comments.
Yeah, this is the run a full Postgres database locally in WASM with reactivity and live sync thing. Basically, they compile real Postgres to WebAssembly so it runs right in the browser, or in Node.
And it's tiny, like under 3 megabytes gzipped. Plus, it supports extensions like PG Vector, so you can do local AI and RAG stuff literally in the browser.
The maintainer even popped into the thread saying they'd crossed over 3 million weekly downloads, nearly 4 million, and that both Firebase and Prisma embed PG Lite in their CLIs to emulate their hosted products.
Yeah, so people in the comments pretty quickly converged on 2 big use cases, local first apps and testing or CI. One commenter called it a sweet spot between in-memory SQLite and a full Postgres container.
Another person described loading a shared schema tarball once, and then using transaction rollback isolation, so tests always start from a clean state. They claimed their test runs got about 5x faster doing that.
There was a whole subthread on why not just SQLite, too. Someone answered that if production runs on Postgres, having Postgres semantics in your tests is a big deal.
The official benchmarks say WASQLite is faster if you're purely in memory. But PG Lite can actually win on single-row CRUD because it uses the Postgres write-ahead log.
Not everyone is sold, though. One commenter linked to posts about memory leaks and multi-second latency and said it feels like a hack compared to SQLite's decades of tuning.
And there's the big caveat. Today, it only supports a single connection. The maintainer called that the key limitation and said they do plan to lift it.
People also pushed on the WASM-only angle. Why WASMification before a native library came up a lot, and the team replied that a native libpglite is on their radar.
Meanwhile, folks are already wrapping it in Rust via Wasmer, experimenting with it in React Native, and talking about Go and Python bindings, like a PyPG Lite.
I really liked the local first angle. Someone talked about running Postgres on both client and server as giving you this homomorphic database environment, meaning the same schema and the same queries everywhere.
And another commenter pointed out it's great for AI-generated prototypes. You can spin up a realistic app with real data persistence entirely in the browser, just for user research.
So, yeah, some fair concerns about performance and limits, but the enthusiasm and the real-world adoption suggest PG Lite is going to be a serious part of the Postgres toolbox.
Yeah, it's one of those feels niche until suddenly it isn't kind of projects.
Next up, we've got State of AI, an empirical 100 trillion token study with OpenRouter, which hit #2 on Hacker News with 171 points and 72 comments.
Yeah, this one's A16Z plus OpenRouter, crunching 100 trillion real-world tokens. And tokens are basically the little word pieces your language model chews on when it thinks.
Their big picture is, on OpenRouter, open-weight models are roughly a third of all traffic. And in the open source world, roleplay and coding totally dominate usage.
Hacker News absolutely fixated on that. Around half of OSS tokens are roleplay line. A bunch of folks argued, come on, a lot of that is just act as a senior X prompt engineering hacks, not real waifu RP.
But then you had people chiming in like, no, there are real whales out there, just lighting money on fire for long-form character chats. So that big roleplay share actually feels pretty plausible.
The bit that stuck with me was, medium is the new small. You can see usage drifting away from those tiny 7B models and concentrating around the 15 to 70B range instead.
One commenter pushed back, though. OpenRouter can't see all the self-hosted 7Bs, so maybe the small models didn't shrink so much as quietly move off the gateway.
They also coined this term, agentic inference, meaning models acting more like agents, planning, calling tools, doing multi-step stuff, instead of just spitting out a one-shot answer. And those reasoning plus tool calling setups are eating a big chunk of tokens.
That lines up with another chart. Programming blows past 50% of usage, and prompts are like 4 times longer now. People are way past write me an essay. They're uploading whole repos and workflows.
The spiciest thread was privacy. OpenRouter samples a tiny fraction of prompts and runs them through Google's classifier, and even with anonymization and opt-in analytics discounts, That really freaks some folks out.
Others were like, look, any gateway can see your traffic. That's just how pipes work. If you truly care, you self-host. Otherwise, you treat this as a fascinating but very partial snapshot of where LLM usage is headed.